mean I'll see it.
Living with someone who is losing their mind is a slow, agonizing process of mourning a person who is still standing right in front of you. My father was always the anchor of our family, a man of logic and quiet strength, but when the dementia started to settle in, that anchor began to drag across the seabed, pulling everything down with it. It started with small things, misplaced keys, forgotten names, but within a year, the house felt like it was haunted by a stranger who just happened to look like my dad. He started avoiding the master bathroom entirely. He'd walk past the door with his head down, shoulders hunched, sometimes even pressing his palm against the wall to steady himself as he scurried toward the kitchen or the living room. When I finally asked him why he wouldn't use his own shower anymore, he looked at me with a hollow, sunken expression that made my stomach turn. He told me there was an old man who lived in the bathroom. He said the man was rude, that he stood there and mimicked everything my father did, mocking his movements with a sneer that didn't belong on a human face. At the time, I handled it the way the doctors told me to. I stayed calm. I validated his feelings. I thought it was just a classic case of mirror sign, a common symptom where the brain can't recognize its own reflection. It was heartbreaking, sure, but I didn't think it was dangerous. I just figured he was scared of his own aging body. Then came the night the screaming started. It wasn't the usual confused rambling or the agitated pacing I'd grown used to. This was a raw, primal sound, the kind of noise a person makes when they are being torn apart. I was in the hallway when it hit me, a jagged shriek that echoed off the hardwood floors and made the hair on my neck stand up. I threw the bathroom door open so hard it cracked against the tile wall. The air in there was freezing, a sharp, sterile cold that seemed to suck the breath right out of my lungs. My father was standing in front of the vanity, his frame trembling violently, his fists balled up. He was swinging at the large, plate-glass mirror with a frantic, desperate energy. The sound of the glass shattering was deafening. Large, jagged shards fell into the sink like guillotine blades, and I could see the dark, viscous liquid already beginning to coat the porcelain. He wasn't just hitting the glass, he was trying to kill it. I grabbed his shoulders, trying to pull him back before he sliced an artery, but he was surprisingly strong, fueled by a terror I couldn't comprehend. He kept whispering over and over, his voice a ragged, wet mess of a sound. He said, he's trying to get out. He's using my face to get out. His knuckles were shredded, the skin hanging in tattered, white flaps, exposing the raw, red meat beneath. The smell hit me then, not the metallic tang people always talk about, but something much worse. It smelled like a butcher shop that had lost power in the middle of a heatwave, sweet, rotting, and thick enough to taste on the back of my tongue. I managed to pin his arms to his sides, and for a second, we both went still. That was when I looked up. In the remaining shards of the mirror, I saw our reflection. My father was sobbing, his chin tucked into his chest, his face a mask of agony and exhaustion. But the reflection didn't move. In the silvered glass, my father was still standing perfectly upright. His reflection wasn't crying. It was looking directly at me with an expression of predatory hunger. The image in the glass had the same shredded knuckles, the same gore dripping onto the counter, but it wasn't flinching. It was smiling. It was a wide, impossible grin that stretched the skin of his cheeks until they looked like they were about to snap. And then, a full second after my father had already slumped toward the floor in my arms, the reflection's eyes slowly blinked. I dragged him out of that room and locked the door behind us, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I spent the rest of the night in his bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with a baseball bat in my lap, watching the door. He eventually fell into a fitful sleep, but he kept clawing at his own face in his dreams, his fingernails digging deep grooves into his cheeks. I had to tape socks over his hands just to keep him from flaying himself alive while he slept. The next morning, I tried to convince myself I had hallucinated the whole thing. Sleep deprivation does weird things to the brain, and the stress of caregiving was reaching a breaking point. I went back into the bathroom to clean up the mess. The floor was covered in glass and large, drying puddles of that dark, clotted fluid. I started picking up the shards, being careful not to look too closely at the remaining pieces of the mirror still stuck to the wall. But as I reached into the sink to grab a particularly large fragment, I saw something that stopped my heart. There, embedded in the drain, were several long, thick strands of gray hair. They weren't just lying there, they were tangled deep in the metal grate, as if someone had been trying to pull themselves through the pipes. I pulled on them, and they kept coming, inches and inches of hair, coated in a thick, grayish slime that looked like liquefied brain matter. And beneath the hair, stuck to the side of the basin, was a piece of skin. It was about the size of a palm, translucent and pale, with the distinct texture of a human fingerprint still visible on the surface. It looked like it had been peeled off while the person was still alive. I didn't call the doctor. I called a contractor to come and tear the whole bathroom out. I told him there was a leak, a bad one, and I wanted the room gutted to the studs. While he worked, I stayed in the living room with my father, who sat in his recliner, staring blankly at the wall. He didn't speak. He didn't even acknowledge the noise of the sledgehammers. He just kept touching his face, tracing the lines of his jaw and his forehead, as if he was checking to see if everything was still where it was supposed to be. The contractor called me back into the hallway about 2 hours later. He looked pale, his hands shaking as he wiped dust from his forehead. He pointed toward the space where the vanity and the mirror had been. "I don't know how to tell you this," he said, his voice dropping to a nervous whisper, "but there's something wrong with the wall behind the glass." I walked in and looked. Behind where the mirror had hung, the drywall had been carved away. Not by a tool, but by something much more blunt and frantic. There was a hollow space in the insulation, a small, cramped cavity just big enough for a person to crouch inside. The wooden studs were covered in deep, jagged gouges, like teeth marks. And all over the insulation were scraps of clothing, small strips of plaid flannel that matched the pajamas my father had been wearing for months. But it was the bottom of the cavity that made me lose my dinner. There was a pile of discarded things. Fingernails. Teeth. Not just a few, but dozens of them, some still attached to bits of necrotic gum tissue. I realized then that my father wasn't just seeing an old man in the mirror. He was watching someone, or something, slowly assemble a version of him from the things it stole. Every time he went in there, it took a little more. A bit of hair. A fingernail. A memory. It was building a suit out of his own identity, waiting for the moment the original was empty enough to be replaced entirely. I moved us out that same day. We went to a small apartment across town, one with no mirrors. I covered the medicine cabinet with contact paper and took down the hall mirror before he even stepped inside. For a few weeks, it seemed like it was working. He was calmer. He started eating again. The wounds on his hands began to heal into thick, ugly scars. I thought maybe, just maybe, we had left whatever that thing was behind in the walls of the old house. But then, 2 nights ago, I woke up to the sound of something wet sliding across the floor. I crept out of bed and saw a sliver of light coming from under the bathroom door. My heart dropped. I knew I had locked it. I pushed the door open, my breath catching in my throat. My father was standing at the sink, staring into the dark, reflective surface of the window. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, his back to me. "Dad," I whispered. He didn't turn around. He slowly raised his hand and pressed it against the glass. The sound it made was sickening, the sound of wet, raw meat being slapped against a cold surface. I walked closer, my legs feeling like lead, my entire body screaming at me to run. When I got close enough to see his face in the window's reflection, I realized it wasn't him. It looked like him, yes. It had his hair, his eyes, his slumped posture. But the skin was wrong. It was too tight in some places and sagging in others, as if it had been stitched together by someone who didn't understand how a human body was supposed to fit. There were no ears, just 2 ragged holes on the sides of the head. The thing in the window looked at me, and its jaw unhinged, dropping far lower than a human jaw should go. It didn't speak. It just made a soft, white clicking sound, like someone stepping through deep mud. I looked down at the floor, and that's when I saw the trail of discarded parts. A pile of gray skin, a few teeth, and the plaid pajamas he had been wearing when we moved. I backed out of the room and locked the door, but I can hear it in there now. It's not screaming anymore. It's practicing. It's making sounds that almost sound like my name, whispered in a voice that is a perfect, terrifying imitation of the man who raised me. And the worst part is, I don't know where my real father is. I don't know if he's still in there, trapped under that stolen skin, or if he's gone entirely, replaced by the thing that finally managed to crawl out of the glass. I'm sitting in the hallway now, staring at the door, and I can see the handle starting to turn. It's slow, deliberate. It knows I'm here. And I know that when that door opens, it's going to have a smile that looks exactly like the one I grew up loving.
Next story.
My grandmother's house always felt like it was holding its breath. It's one of those old Victorian builds in a part of the state where the trees grow too close to the windows, their branches constantly scraping against the glass like fingernails. Since her Alzheimer's took a turn for the worse, the atmosphere in that house shifted from dusty and nostalgic to something genuinely suffocating. It wasn't just the smell of mothballs and souring milk, it was the way the air felt thick, like you were walking through unseen cobwebs every time you entered the dining room. She has this ritual. Every single evening, as the clock in the hallway strikes 6, she moves to the kitchen with a mechanical precision that her disease usually doesn't allow. She sets 3 plates. Not 2, not 1. 3. The first is for her. The second is for my grandfather, who has been buried in the local cemetery since the mid-90s. The third is for someone she simply calls the boy. My mother and I have gone through every basement box and every yellowed family tree record we could find. There was no secret brother, no cousin who died young, no boy in our history at all. Yet every night, she serves a full portion of whatever she's cooked, usually something soft like mashed potatoes or stew, to that empty chair. And she talks to it. She doesn't just mumble, she has animated, back and forth conversations. She'll laugh at a joke we can't hear, or she'll scold him for playing with his food, even though the plate remains untouched. A few weeks ago, the curiosity or maybe just the frustration of seeing her slip further away got the better of me. My mother was in the kitchen washing pans, and my grandmother was sitting there, smiling at the empty space to her left. I watched the way her eyes tracked something moving around the room, something I couldn't see. Her gaze followed a path from the floor up to the height of a small child, eventually settling on the seat of that third chair. I decided to debunk the delusion. I thought if I occupied the space, if I showed her there was nothing there, maybe the fog in her brain would clear for just a second. I walked over and pulled the third chair out. The screech of the wood against the floor sounded unnervingly loud in the quiet house. I sat down firmly. The change in her was instantaneous. The soft, vacant smile she usually wore didn't just fade, it collapsed. Her skin turned a shade of gray that looked like white ash. She didn't look like a confused old woman anymore. She looked like someone who was watching a car tear through a crowd. She leaned forward, her bony fingers gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles looked like they were going to burst through the skin. She didn't look at my face. She looked directly at my lap. "Move," she whispered. It wasn't a suggestion. Her voice had a rasp to it, a jagged edge I'd never heard before. "Get up." "No." I tried to laugh it off, though my heart was starting to hammer against my ribs. I told her it was just me, that there was nobody there. I told her I was hungry and wanted to sit with her. "He's sitting in your lap," she hissed, her eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on the space just above my thighs. "And he doesn't like to share." The moment those words left her mouth, the temperature in the room plummeted. It wasn't a draft. It was a localized, piercing cold that felt like I'd been dunked into a frozen lake. And then I felt it. A pressure. A distinct, physical mass settled onto my knees. It wasn't light like a child should be. It felt dense, a concentrated lump of cold matter that seemed to press through my jeans and into my very bone marrow. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt pinned. It was as if my muscles had turned to lead. I looked down, and for a split second, I swear the fabric of my pants was indented, pushed down by the invisible weight of 2 small feet and a tiny backside. Then the smell hit me. It wasn't the scent of a child. It was the odor of a stagnant pond, thick, cloying, and metallic. It smelled like raw meat left in a sun-warmed trunk, mixed with the sharp, stinging scent of old, rusted iron. It was the smell of something that had been dead a very long time but was somehow still wet. My grandmother started to weep, but she didn't move to help me. She just watched. "He's angry," she moaned, rocking back and forth. "You're hurting him. He's going to show you. He's going to show you what they did." Suddenly, the weight on my lap shifted. I felt a coldness creep up my chest, like freezing fingers tracing my ribs. I looked toward my grandmother, pleading for her to stop this, but she was staring at the air right in front of my face. Her eyes were tracking something rising up toward my throat. I felt a sharp, stinging pressure on my neck. It felt like a dull blade or a jagged fingernail was being slowly drawn across my skin. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt like it was being sucked out through the keyholes. My vision started to blur at the edges, turning a bruised purple. I finally found the strength to scream a ragged, choked sound, and I threw myself backward. The chair flipped over with a violent crash. I scrambled away on my hands and knees, dragging myself toward the doorway where my mother was now standing, frozen in shock. I looked back at the table. My grandmother was still sitting there. The third chair was upright again. I hadn't touched it, but it was back in its place, tucked neatly under the table. On the plate that had been empty seconds before, was a pile of something dark and glistening. I crept closer, my legs still trembling so hard I could barely stand. It wasn't the stew my grandmother had cooked. It was a heap of small, grayish organs. They looked like they belonged to a small animal, or perhaps something else. They were covered in a thick, dark fluid that didn't look like sauce. It was viscous and nearly black, pooling on the white ceramic. The smell of that rusted iron and rot filled the room, making my stomach churn with a violent, acidic heat. My grandmother picked up her fork. She looked at the empty air next to her and nodded, a tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. "He says you can stay," she whispered, her voice devoid of any emotion. "But only if you watch." She took a bite of the gray meat on her own plate, meat that hadn't been there when she started eating, and chewed slowly. I looked at the third plate again. The pile of organs was smaller. Something was eating. I could hear the faint, wet sound of grinding, like teeth gnashing through gristle, coming from the empty space. I ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the house, standing in the middle of the driveway under the cold moonlight. My mother followed me out, her face a mask of pure terror. She didn't ask me what happened. She just grabbed my arm and pointed at my neck. In the rearview mirror of the car, I saw them. 4 distinct, bruised imprints of small fingers wrapped around my throat. And on my lap, where the weight had been, were 2 damp, muddy stains in the shape of a child's footprints. They weren't made of mud, though. When I touched them, my fingers came away stained with a dark, tacky substance that smelled of salt and old, decaying earth. We haven't been back to the house after dark since then. We moved my grandmother to a facility, but the nurses there have started complaining. They say she refuses to eat unless they bring in an extra chair. They say that sometimes, when they pass her room at night, they hear the sound of a child laughing, a wet, gurgling laugh that sounds like someone trying to breathe through a throat full of fluid. But the worst part is the dreams. Every night, I feel that freezing weight settle onto my chest. I wake up gasping for air, the smell of rusted iron filling my bedroom, and for a split second before I turn on the light, I I can see a pair of small, gray feet dangling at the edge of my bed. He didn't want to share the chair. No, I don't think he wants to share me either.
Next story.
The house always had a specific smell, a mixture of old floral wallpaper, lemon wax, and that faint, sour tang of stagnant air that settles in a place where the windows are never opened. It wasn't a bad smell, just the smell of my childhood, until it wasn't. My mother started slipping away about 6 months ago. The doctors called it early onset dementia, but what happened in that house felt less like a medical condition and more like a physical haunting of time itself. She didn't just forget who I was, she completely rewrote the reality of the 4 walls we lived in. She regressed to a single, specific Tuesday in 1974. The first time it happened, I was bringing her a tray of tea. She looked at me, not with the clouded eyes of a sick woman, but with a sharp, defensive glare. She asked me if I was there for the rent. She didn't see her daughter, she saw a landlord she hadn't spoken to in 50 years. She told me the radiator in the back room was leaking and that she wouldn't pay a cent more until the floorboards were replaced. It was jarring, but I played along, thinking it was just a bad episode. I didn't realize then that the mother I knew was already gone, replaced by a recording that was starting to loop. The precision of her routine was what started to grind away at my sanity. Every single morning, she would wake up at exactly 7:14. I would hear her feet hit the floorboards, thump, thump, then a long pause before she opened the wardrobe. She would put on a mustard yellow polyester dress that she hadn't actually owned in decades. I don't even know where she got it. It looked brand new, the fabric stiff and vibrant, completely out of place against her wrinkled, papery skin. She spent every waking hour preparing for a party. She would stand in the kitchen, humming a song that I couldn't find on any record or radio station, slicing cucumbers into paper-thin translucent discs. She would arrange them on a platter in a perfect, concentric circle. If a single slice was off by a millimeter, she would stare at it for 10 minutes, her eyes unblinking, until she corrected it. It was like watching a machine perform a task it had been programmed to do a million times before. The atmosphere in the house grew thick and suffocating. It wasn't a weight you could lift, it was more like the air had turned into a gelatinous mass that made every movement feel labored and slow. The light in the living room always seemed to have a sepia tint to it, even at noon on a cloudy day. I started to feel like a ghost in my own home, a blurred figure moving through a high-definition photograph from the 70s. One afternoon, I tried to break the cycle. She was standing by the rotary phone, which wasn't even plugged into the wall, pretending to talk to her sister about what wine to bring. I walked up to her and placed my hand on her shoulder. I called her Mom. I told her that it was 2026, that her sister had been dead for 10 years, and that she needed to sit down and take her medication. The moment my fingers touched the polyester of her dress, she froze. It wasn't the way a person stops moving, it was the way a film frame catches in a projector. Her mouth remained half open, her hand hovering an inch from the plastic receiver. She didn't breathe. I waited for her to blink, for her chest to rise, for any sign of life, but there was nothing. She felt like cold marble under my palm. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, and the second I returned to the doorway where I usually stood to watch her, she clicked back into motion. She finished her sentence exactly where she left off, her voice carrying the same youthful lilt, completely unaware that she had just spent 3 minutes as a statue. That was when the gore started to manifest. It wasn't that she was hurting herself, at least, not in the way you think. It was the house. The house was trying to keep up with her memory of 1974, and it was failing in the most gruesome ways. I went into the bathroom one evening and found the sink overflowing. But it wasn't water. It was a dark, viscous fluid that smelled like a slaughterhouse, the scent of raw, iron-rich meat left out in the sun, that thick, metallic stench that clings to the back of your throat and makes you want to gag. It was bubbling up from the pipes, staining the white porcelain a deep, bruised crimson. I ran to get a mop, but when I looked at my mother, she was standing in the hallway, smiling. She told me the landlord really needed to do something about the plumbing, as if the blood on the floor was just a minor inconvenience. I looked down at her feet and saw that she was standing right in the middle of a puddle of it. The red liquid was soaking into her sensible low-heeled shoes, turning the beige leather into a sodden, dark mess. She didn't seem to feel the wetness. She just kept talking about the hors d'oeuvres. The deeper she sank into the loop, the more the reality around us began to fray. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of wet, rhythmic slapping. I crept down the stairs, the air feeling colder and more restrictive with every step. I found her in the dining room. She was setting the table for 12 guests. She didn't have any plates, so she was using pieces of raw, sliced liver she must have taken from the fridge, though I didn't remember buying any. She was meticulously laying them out on the wood, smoothing them down with her palms. The sound was sickening, the slide of wet organ meat against polished mahogany. She looked up at me, her face splattered with tiny droplets of dark fluid. "You're late with the repairs," she whispered. Her voice sounded like it was coming from a great distance, muffled and distorted. "The guests will be here soon, and the walls are still weeping." I looked at the walls, and my stomach turned. The floral wallpaper was peeling back in long, wet strips, revealing something underneath that looked like dark, red muscle fiber. It was pulsing. Not a fast pulse, but a slow, rhythmic throb that matched the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The room didn't smell like old paper anymore. It smelled like an open wound, that sharp, sickly sweet aroma of decay mixed with the saltiness of fresh plasma. I tried to pull her away, but she was immovable. It was like trying to push a mountain. She was anchored to that moment in time, and any attempt to move her caused the glitch to intensify. When I grabbed her arm, her skin felt wrong. It didn't feel like skin, it felt like cold, wet parchment stretched over a frame of rusted iron. She didn't look at me. She just stared at the front door, waiting for guests that had been dead for decades. The climax came on the night the party was supposed to happen. I couldn't leave the house. The front door wouldn't budge, as if the world outside had simply ceased to exist. I was trapped in 1974 with a woman who was becoming less human by the hour. At 8 p.m. sharp, the doorbell rang. It was a hollow, echoing sound that vibrated through my very teeth. My mother rushed to the door, her face lit up with a terrifying, manic joy. She opened it, and for a second, I saw them, the guests. They weren't people. They were flickering, translucent shapes, like static on an old television screen, but they were dressed in suits and gowns. They moved into the house in a silent, jerky procession. As they passed me, I felt a wave of intense, numbing cold. They sat at the table, picking up the slices of raw meat with their shimmering hands. My mother was laughing, a sound that was jagged and wrong, like glass breaking in a velvet bag. She started carving a roast that wasn't there, her knife scraping loudly against the wood of the table, carving deep, jagged gashes into the mahogany. Blood, real, thick, dark blood, began to leak from the cuts in the table, pouring onto the floor in a steady stream. I tried to scream, but the air was too thick to carry the sound. I felt like I was being buried alive in the atmosphere of 50 years ago. I looked at my mother, and her eyes were gone. They were just flat, black discs reflecting the flickering light of the candles she had lit, candles that smelled like burning hair and old grease. She turned to me, the knife still in her hand, dripping with that dark, non-copper smelling gore. "The landlord is still here," she told the empty air. "He's watching us. He's an intruder in our home." The guests all turned their static-filled heads toward me. I realized then that I wasn't just losing my mother. I was being erased by a memory that was stronger than the present. The house wasn't a house anymore. It was a digestive tract, breaking down the present to feed a hungry, looped past. I'm writing this from the upstairs bedroom. I managed to get away, but the stairs have vanished. Where the hallway used to be, there is only a shimmering, dark void that smells of old earth and rot. Downstairs, the party is still going. I can hear the scraping of the knife, The wet slap of the meat and my mother's laughter, repeating every 20 minutes, exactly the same way, forever. The walls in here are starting to pulse now. The floral pattern is beginning to bleed. I can feel the 1974 version of this room closing in on me, pushing out the air, replacing it with the scent of lemon wax and death. I'm not sure how much longer I have before I become a part of the script, just another static-filled guest at a party that never ends. The doorbell just rang again. It's 8 p.m. It's always 8 p.m.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.